A good Erev Shabbos, good Chodesh. We wish each other good Chodesh in Yiddish or Chodesh Tov in Hebrew on the new Hebrew month. And this is the new month of Adar, a time of increased joy, the month of Purim. There's a lot to be worried about, a lot to be stressed out about in the world. And we have to cultivate that feeling of joy, that inner joy, real joy. No matter what's going on, we know that God is in charge. There is a purpose and a reason for everything. And God knows there's a lot of it that we can't understand and won't understand. But we trust our Creator in heaven who made this world for a reason and guides everything with purpose. And as Adar comes in, our joy increases. And there's actually a beautiful little incident that we're going to talk about in today's daf about that even when times are tough, in this case, you can make time for Torah study, which for the sages always gave them joy. We'll get into that in a moment. Who's in the house? Bill in Mid-Missouri, Gordo in Scotland, Guy in Ohio, Renee in Indiana, Joe in the Inland Empire, Yehud in South Carolina, Melissa in Great Neck, Bella in Florida, Tom in PA, Sharon in New Jersey, Ella in Southern California. Welcome, everybody. This week, again, we're doing the special Friday time for winter, since Shabbat comes in so early. And next week will be the last time we do that. Because then the clocks change, not tomorrow night, but a week from tomorrow night. And after that, we'll just go back to the regular Friday time of noon Pacific. Okay, we're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 8 here in chapter 7 of Tractate Sanhedrin, 24th volume of the Talmud. We're picking it up at the bottom of page 60b. Our daf today is page 61. And we're talking about, this has been a whole section on the death penalty. And how the death penalty would apply to avodah zarah, one who commits the transgression of idol worship, idolatry. And we were talking about yesterday, as the Mishna said, and we're getting into greater detail here in the Gemara of what are the elements of the transgression, of the crime of idol worship? When have you actually committed it? Right? So, if you, the example is given in the Mishnah that if you defecate in front of an idol, well, it sounds like you're really disrespecting that idol that maybe is somebody else's god. You're certainly not committing the sin of idolatry, unless that idol is Baal Peor, which was some kind of a made-up deity that people worshipped in a cult-like manner in ancient times, and the way that they worshiped their idol, hard to imagine, was to defecate in front of it. So if you defecate in front of that idol, and you're a Jew, well, then you committed the sin of idolatry. So that's an example. We'll get into more. Now, the discussion that we're in right now, that we sort of interrupted yesterday, is how do we know that if you bow before an idol, or that you slaughter an animal to an idol, even if perhaps that's not the normal way that the people who worship that idol worship it, but if a Jew bows to that idol or slaughters an animal for it, he would be guilty of idolatry. That's the discussion we're in. So the Baraisa that we've been examining stated the principle concerning the forms of idol worship that are punishable by execution, and that this is derived from the verse that mentions slaughtering an animal as an idolatrous offering. Right? So the Torah says, if you slaughter an animal to some statue, to the gods of other people, that's idolatry. So that's pretty specific. Whereas bowing to an idol is mentioned in the verse as an exception. So what does that mean? So Rav Hanan said to Abaye, say that bowing is singled out, not to tell you that you can bow to an idol, you certainly can't. But why was this example given when we already know that any kind of idolatrous practice is prohibited? Let's light up the darkness. Did Nina notice that I didn't light the candle? Did somebody tell her? I just love that we are all on the same team. Okay. Where was I? Okay, so the point is, we know that bowing is prohibited, but why was this extra example given? This invites interpretation. In other words, that there's some other teaching, some other law that we're learning from the fact that this example was given after already all practices are prohibited. So Rava bar Rav Hanan said to Abaye, say that bowing is singled out to be mentioned to teach, with regard to the entire category, that any honorable form of worship, when performed for the sake of idol worship, carries the death penalty, not only sacrificial rites performed in the temple. In other words, what the priests do, the Kohanim in the holy temple, anything that they do, right, which would include slaughtering an animal, bringing parts of that animal or all of the animal on the altar and burning it, eating part of it as a sin offering, sprinkling its blood on the altar, burning incense, any of the practices that the Kohanim did in the Holy Temple, if a Jew were to do one of those practices for the benefit or for the sake of his worshiping some idol, that would definitely trigger liability for the death penalty. Again, do we apply the death penalty? It'd be very difficult, probably never happen. But it's just to understand, would it apply? Would the death penalty apply if a Jew did that? So certainly any of the practices that the Kohanim did in the Holy Temple, if he did it for an idol, he violated this, he committed the sin of idolatry. And it sounds like bowing is there to tell us that any kind of a practice that is normally associated with honoring, right, whether honoring God or honoring some individual, if you did it for an idol, you would have committed idolatry. And if you would say that, if so, why do I need slaughter to be mentioned in the verse specifically? Now that you've said any of the practices that the Kohanim do, well, obviously slaughter is one of those, so why mention slaughter as an example in the Torah? Then one can say that mentioning slaughter is necessary for the matter of slaughter itself, i.e. to teach that one can have intention from one sacrificial rite to another sacrificial rite. That's difficult to understand. What does it mean? In other words, slaughtering an animal with idolatrous intent is punishable by death, even if the intention of the transgressor pertains not to the slaughter itself, but to another part of the sacrificial process. In other words, if he says to himself, not I'm slaughtering this animal in order to worship this idol, but rather I'm slaughtering this animal so that I will, get some blood from the slaughter and then sprinkle that blood on the altar, then even before he sprinkled the blood on not the altar, but on the idol, as a form of worship, since he slaughtered the animal for that purpose, then he's already committed idolatry when he slaughtered the animal. As it was stated, with regard to one who slaughters an animal in order to sprinkle its blood in idol worship or burn its fat in idol worship, Rabbi Yochanan says, deriving benefit from the animal is prohibited, as it is considered an offering of idol worship, even if its blood was not ultimately sprinkled for idol worship or its forbidden fat burned for that purpose. And Reish Lakish says, deriving benefit from the animal is permitted, meaning that if he slaughtered the animal in order to sprinkle blood on it as a form of idolatry, then even if he never sprinkled the blood on it, you can no longer derive any benefit from that animal because it was slaughtered for the purpose of idolatry. Rabbi Yochanan would say, well, since he never used it for idolatry, he had intent like that, but he never ended up sprinkling the blood on the idol, then therefore you could get benefit from the animal. Not use it for idolatry, but eat it. You could eat it or, sell its meat or something. You could get benefit from it because it never was used for idolatry. That's Reish Lakish's view, but we actually follow Rabbi Yochanan that if it was slaughtered with an idolatrous purpose in mind, it now becomes prohibited even for any kind of benefit. We're on 61a. Rava bar Rav Hanan concludes his analysis. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, who derives this law from another source, this statement in the Baraisa works out well. The verse that mentions the slaughter of an animal in idol worship apparently teaches a principle. as it is superfluous with regard to the law of slaughter itself, as stated in the Baraisa. We already know that slaughter would be prohibited. Why do we need to mention it specifically? But according to Reish Lakish, who does not derive from any verse that one can have intention from one rite to another rite, that you would slaughter it just to use it for its blood, and therefore it becomes prohibited, Reish Lakish doesn't agree with that. One needs this verse to derive precisely this law, that one can have intention from one rite to another rite. Consequently, the verse is not superfluous, and it cannot be assumed that it teaches a principle with regard to the forms of idol worship that are punishable by death. Rav Papa objects. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, does one not need a verse to teach the law in a case of intention from one rite to another rite? Right? They're all agreeing that that you committed idolatry. What they're disagreeing about is whether you could use that animal for some other benefit if the idolatry was never committed. It was never finished, let's say. It was never actually performed, even though there was an intent to perform idolatry at the time that the animal was slaughtered. They're all agreeing, and as is so often the case, the puzzle here is not, is idolatry prohibited? Yes, it's prohibited. Is any aspect of participating in idolatry prohibited? Yes, it's prohibited. But the specific elements of idolatry and their consequence, the sages might derive from different verses in the Torah. They were getting to the same place, but how do we know that that's the law? They're going to use different verses in the Torah to arrive there, right? So says Rav Papa, according to Rabbi Yochanan, does one not need a verse to teach the law in a case of intention from one rite to another rite? Rabbi Yochanan initially only prohibits deriving benefit from the animal. But if not for this verse, the man who slaughtered the animal would not be liable to receive the death penalty. And therefore, the verse comes to render the man liable to receive the death penalty. Therefore, this verse is not superfluous according to Rabbi Yochanan either. He needs different verses to teach different aspects of this law. That it's prohibited, that the punishment would be the death penalty, that this kicks in even if you slaughter the animal, but not for the purpose of worshiping via slaughter, but rather just to get its blood so you could use it for a different rite. All these things are prohibited, but he's getting that proof from different verses. Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ika, objects to Rav Bar Rav Hanan's challenge to the derivation of the Baraisa, and the derivation in the Baraisa. And even according to Reish Lakish, does one need a verse to teach that one who slaughtered the animal is liable? Reish Lakish only permits one to derive benefit from the animal, but the man is certainly liable to receive the death penalty since he slaughtered the animal, intending to use its blood for idolatry. This is just as the law is in the case of one who bows to a mountain, as deriving benefit from the mountain is permitted, but nevertheless the one who worshipped it is liable to be executed by the sword. Right? If somebody commits idolatry by saying that mountain, God forbid somebody would say this, that mountain is God, is a God, and this guy says he's going to go worship it. Right? So he's made an idol out of that mountain. And now he's performed idolatry with it by bowing down to it. So if he's a Jew, he would be liable to the death penalty. Right? Are we going to apply it? There's many other elements that would be needed as a matter of criminal procedure. But did he commit an act that would render one liable for the death penalty? Yes. We just said that if you use something for idolatry, it becomes prohibited for benefit. So now that one guy committed idolatry by bowing down to a mountain, are we going to say that the rest of us can never walk on that mountain? No. The mountain is still a mountain. The fact that this guy, his warped mind wanted to worship the mountain doesn't render the mountain prohibited. So if that's the case, why do we hold like Rabbi Yochanan and say that this guy who slaughtered an animal in order to receive its blood and sprinkle it on an idol, and then actually the blood was never sprinkled on the idol, you didn't even get that far, he only had that intent, why would we say that the animal now is prohibited for benefit? Isn't it like the mountain? We can walk on the mountain. Why can't we, make a hamburger out of that animal that was slaughtered with idolatrous intent, but was never used for idolatry? So Rav Acha of Difti said to Ravina, according to what Rava bar Rav Hanan said to Abaye, that there is room to say that bowing was singled out in the verse to teach, with regard to the entire category, that any honorable form of worship carries the death penalty, there is a difficulty. Hold on a second. Yeah, there is a difficulty. So with regard to the verse, quote, take heed to yourself that you not be ensnared to follow them, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? So I will do likewise. That's Deuteronomy 12:30. Right? The God is telling Moshe to write in the Torah that there's going to be a lot of specific prohibitions on idolatry, and God is going to express, very explicitly and, with emotional language, that you shall not commit idolatry, and you will be tempted to commit idolatry, and you will run after the other nations, and you will want to imitate them and do like them. Right? Don't do it. Right? God is saying over and over again, don't do it. So that because there are multiple verses on this subject in the Torah, what are we learning out from each one? Is the Torah just being redundant, or is it teaching some novel aspect of that law with each one? So this particular verse, take heed to yourself that you not be ensnared to follow them, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? So I will do likewise. Well, this indicates that one is liable for worshiping an idol in the manner that the non-Jews worship it. So this is stated to exclude what? To exclude or include what? Here it's asking to exclude what? And if you would say that this verse is stated to exclude one who defecates before an idol that is worshipped by sacrificing offerings, it is not necessary to derive this law from this verse, as it is derived from the law of bowing to an idol, as follows. Just as bowing is an honorable form of worship, right? In other words, you're honoring something, and is punishable by death, so too any honorable form of worship is punishable by death when performed as idol worship, which excludes an offensive act such as defecating. Right? If you even though defecating before an idol is the way to worship Baal Peor, if you do it before any other idol, it would not be considered idolatry because it's so disrespectful. Whereas even if Baal Peor is worshipped by defecating in front of it, if you go and, as a Jew, go and bow before it, you would have committed idolatry, because bowing is a way to show honor, and you're showing honor to an idol, even if that's not the way it's normally worshipped. Therefore, the law that one is not liable for defecating before an idol can be derived from bowing. So what are we going to learn from the verse that was just stated if it's not this? So rather, this verse is stated to exclude one who defecates before the idol called Mercury, which is not its typical manner of worship, right? Mercury, you throw rocks at it. So that's normally considered offensive behavior. So you might have thought that Mercury is worshipped by throwing rocks at it. Baal Peor is worshipped by defecating before it. Both of those are kinds of offensive actions. So you might have thought that, well, if you defecate before Mercury, since that's an offensive action, but not the particular offensive action for there, you might still be guilty of idol worship. This is going to come and teach you that it's not. Right, it might enter your mind to say that since the standard manner of worship of Mercury, namely throwing stones at it, is in any event an act of degradation, so too one who performs any act of degradation as worship of Mercury should be liable. Therefore, the verse teaches us that one is liable only for worshiping Mercury in its standard manner of worship. The Gemara raises an objection, but Rav Hamnuna's interpretation of the verses appears to contradict that which Rabbi Eliezer says. From where is it derived that one who sacrifices an animal to Mercury is liable? As it is stated, and they shall no longer sacrifice their sacrifices to the satyrs. That's Leviticus 17:7. So now Rabbi Eliezer explains. If the verse is not needed for the matter of one who worships an idol in its typical manner, i.e. one who sacrifices an animal as an offering to an idol that is worshipped by sacrificing offerings, as the law in this case is already written in the aforementioned verse when it said, how do these nations serve their gods? So I will do likewise. That was, right, Deuteronomy, the one we just read a moment ago. Deuteronomy 12:30. I shall do likewise. So therefore, apply that verse to the matter of one who worships an idol, not in its typical manner, by sacrificing an offering to an idol that is not typically worshipped by sacrificing offerings. Therefore, one who sacrifices an offering to Mercury is liable, even though that is not its typical form of worship, because sacrificing animals is typically is a typical form of worship, even though that's not typical for Mercury. If a Jew did it before Mercury, he would have violated this and be liable to the death penalty. According to Rav bar Rav Chana, and by contrast, it is derived that one is liable for worshiping an idol in any honorable manner, even not in its typical manner of worship. But from where do we derive it? From the law of bowing, not from this verse that we just mentioned. So the Gemara answers, there in the verse mentioned by Rabbi Eliezer, the reference is to one who sacrifices an offering to Mercury, not as a form of worship, but rather in order to express insolence toward the Torah prohibition against sacrificing an offering to an idol. It is derived from the verse that this too is a transgression of the prohibition and renders one liable for the death penalty. Right? Very interesting. That, they're getting again into the intention. So they're saying that, okay, he worshipped Mercury either in its form of worship, which is throwing rocks at it, or in a standard form of worship, which is slaughtering offerings. But he didn't do that because he cares about Mercury. He's not worshiping Mercury. What he's saying is he's angry at God and the Torah, and he's going to do this thing that is clearly a violation of Torah just for the purpose of violating Torah. He's angry at God, or he's angry at the Jews, he's angry at Torah, and he's just going to do this for the purpose of violating the Torah, not because he really cares about Mercury. Is he liable to the death penalty? Yeah, because, is that somehow better than worshiping Mercury? That he is, it sounds a little bit like blasphemy. It's not, but he's committing an act of idolatry just so he can violate the Torah. Okay, well then take the consequences. New subject. The Gemara relates Rav Hamnuna lost his oxen and he went to search for them. Rabbah met him and raised a contradiction between two Mishnayos. We learned in the Mishnah that one who worships idol is liable. One who worships idols is liable. And now we're going to have a conversation about whether somebody has committed idolatry or not in certain specific circumstances. What does that have to do with Rav Hamnuna losing his oxen? Nothing. Nothing. But the conversation that Rav Hamnuna and Rabbah are having about Torah, and specifically this law, and that's why it's listed here in this section, is happening while Rav Hamnuna lost his oxen, right? So what does it mean to lose your oxen? It's not just like, he had a favorite ox and he was looking for his ox and, he cared about his ox, and then they're having a conversation. Think of it like you're not rich, you have a car, you need that car. And if you don't have that car, you can't get to work, your life is going to be upside down. You're stressed out. You're looking for that car. You need that car. In the midst of this stress, you run into a friend and you start talking Torah, and it's like you're just not even thinking about, the fact that you need to find that ox. That's what's happening here with Rav Hamnuna. It's just show you how much love they have for Torah and the process of coming at halachas and trying to understand God's will in every facet of our lives. And they're ready to do that even in the midst of personal anxiety and stress. So, what are they talking about? A contradiction between two Mishnas. We learned in the Mishnah that one who worships idols is liable. Okay, simple. Idolatry is prohibited. If you worship an idol, you're liable. Okay, got that. By inference, one who worships idols, yes, he is liable. But one who merely says that he will worship idols is not liable. So you don't become liable for idolatry until you actually go perform the act of worship. If you say, I'm going to go, or this guy says he's going to go and worship the idol, has he already committed idolatry? Sounds like no. Only when he actually does it. Expressing an intent to do it is not a violation of the prohibition on idolatry, only when you do it. But didn't we learn in another Mishnah that we're going to encounter on page 67a? One who says, I will worship an idol, or I will go and worship an idol, or let us go and worship an idol, is liable. Just as one who actually worships an idol is liable. So evidently one is liable for merely stating his intention to engage in idol worship. So which is it? Do you become guilty of idolatry only when you do it, or even when you say you're going to go and do it. Rav Hamnuna said to him, the Mishnah here is referring to one who states, I intend to accept this idol upon myself as a god only through worship. Consequently, he is liable only when he actually worships it. One who intends to accept the idol as a god immediately is liable even before he actually worships it. Right? So in other words, the one who is not liable until he actually does it, it's because when he said, I'm going to go do it, he was more specific than that. He said, I'm going to go worship this idol, and when I have worshiped the idol, then I will look at that idol as a god. But until then, not. He's not liable. But one who just says, let's go worship that idol, or I'm going to go worship that idol, he has already committed idolatry. Right? That's this interpretation of it. Right? That's how Rav understands it. Rav Hamnuna said to him, that's how Rav Hamnuna looks at it, right? So that's how he interprets it. Rav Yosef said, this answer is unnecessary. Have you removed the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnah, from the world? I.e., they've already argued about this question. It is a dispute between Tanaim, as it is taught in a Baraisa. In the case of one who says, I am a god, come and worship me, Rabbi Meir deems him liable for incitement to idol worship, and Rabbi Yehuda deems him exempt. Has he done something that is okay, according to Rabbi Yehuda? No, certainly not. But has he committed the elements of idolatry that we're examining here? Not yet, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Right, so the guy says, I am a god, come and worship me. Has he committed idolatry? Interesting. Rabbi Meir says yes, but not he committed idolatry. Rather, he's inciting others to commit idolatry. He's calling himself a god, which is a nonsense statement, but he's telling others, come and worship me, so he's inciting them to commit idolatry, according to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says he hasn't incited them to commit idolatry. Why? The Gemara explains. In a case where those to whom the inciter spoke subsequently worshipped him, okay, everyone agrees that the inciter is liable. As it is written, you shall not make yourself a graven image. Right? Not only you shall not make for yourself a graven image, build an idol and worship it, but don't make of yourself a graven image, right? Don't turn yourself, don't call yourself a god that others should worship, like Pharaoh did. Which is interpreted to include a case where one establishes himself as a god, right? So if you say to people, come worship me, and they do it, okay, then for sure you committed the sin of inciting others to idolatry. If they don't do it, it sounds like you haven't done that, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir holds, so where they disagree is in a case where this incident ended in mere speech. This guy said, I'm a god, come and worship me, and nothing else happened. So Rabbi Meir holds that speech is a significant matter. And therefore, since the inciter spoke the words that could have resulted in people worshiping him, he's already committed incitement to idolatry. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda holds that speech is nothing. Therefore, the contradiction between the Mishnayos can be resolved by attributing each Mishnah to a different Tana, where words that don't result in anything are not going to be considered a crime in themselves. That would be Rabbi Yehuda, whereas Rabbi Meir says if those words led to somebody committing a crime, we would agree that the incitement was committed. Then even if the crime is not committed, the same words are already incitement, even if they don't result in the crime. So that's why Rabbi Meir would find him liable. Rav Yosef then said, after reconsidering the matter, what I said is not correct. Rav Yosef is a big man. As even according to Rabbi Yehuda, one is deemed liable for speech as well. How do we know? As we learned in the Maraisa that Rabbi Yehuda says, actually one is not liable unless he says, I will worship, or I will go and worship, or let us go and worship. So evidently Rabbi Yehuda holds that one is liable even for speech alone, not only for actual worship. Accordingly, with regard to what principle do Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda actually disagree? They disagree with regard to the case of one who incites others to worship him, and the others say to him, yes, we will worship you. So one sage, Rabbi Meir, holds that when one incites others to worship him, they are apt to listen to him. And the response, yes, that they say to him is sincere. And the other sage, Rabbi Yehuda, holds that when one incites others to worship himself, they are not apt to listen to him, as they say to themselves, in what way is he different from us? The suggestion to worship him is nonsense. And the fact that they say to him, yes, is simply because they're ridiculing him. Right? So do we know that when that the incitement to idolatry, when somebody is saying worship me, I'm a god, right? And he says, says to other people, worship me, and then they say yes. So was that yes real? Has he actually convinced them that they should come and worship him even before they've done it? Or are they just mocking him when they say yes? And so there's no proof that the incitement has been successful. Now we're on page 61b. And the contradiction between the Mishnayos can be resolved as follows. There, where the Mishnah states that one is liable for speech alone, the reference is to an individual who was incited. Here, where the Mishnah indicates that one is not liable for speech alone, it is referring to a case of an incited multitude of people. So the Gemara explains the difference. An individual who was incited does not typically change his mind as he goes astray after idol worship. Therefore, once he agrees to the suggestion to worship an idol, he has fully accepted the idol upon himself as a god, and he becomes liable. By contrast, a multitude of people are apt to change their minds, and consequently, they do not go astray after idol worship. I mean, it's interesting. It sounds like a mob, once it's moving, it's harder to change than one guy, right? But what they're also saying is that the mob will contain lots of people with differing points of view, any one of whom at any point could say, what are we doing? This is crazy. And once that person stops, maybe others will join him. So even if part of the mob goes ahead and commits the idolatry, part of the mob won't. And then it's much harder to say the one who incited, who did he incite and who did he not? Abaye raised an objection to Rav Yosef's opinion. Is there a difference in law between the cases of an incited multitude of people and an individual who was incited? But isn't it taught in a baraisa with regard to the verse, quote, if your brother, the son of your mother, or your son, or your daughter, or the wife of your bosom, or your neighbor, who is like your own soul, incites you secretly, saying, let us go and serve other gods, that's Deuteronomy 13:7, that both an individual who was incited and an incited multitude of people are included in this law. But the verse singles out the individual from the category of the multitude, and another verse singles out the multitude from the category of the individual. I mean, it's interesting, right? That when the Torah could have simply said, if anyone incites you to go worship other gods, you shall not listen to him, and you will, subject him to the death penalty. Why does the Torah give all these examples, right? That begs for interpretation, right? Why does the Torah say, if your brother, who is the son of your mother, or your son, or your daughter, or the wife of your bosom, or your neighbor who is like your own soul, incites you secretly? It must be that each of those terms is there for a reason, right? It would be utterly redundant to list all those cases. Right now, we're not going to go into each of those cases, but that's the kind of thing that the sages would always do. Now, the Torah states separately the laws of an individual who is incited to engage in idol worship and of an entire city that is subverted to engage in idol worship in order to distinguish between the two cases as follows, right? So, first of all, who's doing the inciting? That could be a group or that could be an individual. I think right here we're talking about an individual who's doing the inciting. And who is incited? It could be an individual or it could be a group. So the law talks about this, the Torah talks about this as two separate laws. One who incites an individual or even a group of individuals, but as individuals, to commit idolatry, he's going to be punished death penalty, but a different death penalty. And one who incites a whole city to commit idolatry, bigger sin, right? Obviously, he's incited many people to go do this. And then when a whole town or a whole city is subverted to idolatry, more than half the residents have become idolatrous in Israel, that town is burned to the ground, and nothing that was in that town people can never derive benefit from it again, right? So there's a distinction between one who incites an individual or one who incites a group. An individual who was incited is singled out from the category of a subverted multitude of people in order to render the punishment to an individual's body more stringent. The individual is executed by stoning, whereas the residents of an idolatrous city, the big group, are executed by decapitation. And an individual who was singled out to render the treatment of the property of the individual who was incited more lenient, as it is not destroyed like the property of the residents of an idolatrous city, where the whole city was subverted. And additionally, the Torah singles out the subverted multitude of people from the category of an individual who was incited in order to render the punishment given to the bodies of the residents of an idolatrous city, decapitation, more lenient than the punishment given to an individual who was incited, and to render the treatment of their property more stringent, as the city and the property of its residents are burned. Abaye concluded his objection to Rav Yosef's opinion. So from all this, it can be inferred from the Baraisa that only with regard to this matter, i.e. the laws mentioned in the Baraisa, is the law of an individual who was incited different than that of an incited multitude of people. But with regard to all other halachic matters, they are the same. Therefore, a distinction cannot be made between them with regard to the law in the case of a verbal commitment to idol worship. We're talking about they might have different death penalties, different rules about whether their property can be used or not after they were executed for idolatry, once they were incited to idolatry. But in terms of the laws of, did the inciter commit incitement when the people who were incited said, yeah, we're going to go do it, before they actually committed the idolatry, we're not going to have a distinction there between one who incites an individual and one who incites a multitude. Rather, Abaye said that the contradiction between these Mishnayos, going back to the Mishnahs that we started this section, right, where somebody says, I will go, one is guilty of idolatry only when he commits idolatry, versus one who says, I will go commit idolatry, has already committed idolatry. That's the contradiction that we're still talking about, is resolved like this, according to Abaye. Here, where the Mishnah indicates that one is liable only for actual worship, only for actual active idolatry, the reference is to one who incited by himself. Incited by himself. What does that mean? I.e., no one incited him to go commit idol worship. He made the decision on his own. He heard about the idol, he researched the idol, he said, this sounds good to me, and then he committed idolatry. No one incited him. Whereas there in the Mishnah that deems one liable for stating that he will worship an idol as soon as he states that he's going to do it, the reference is to one who is incited by others. They say, come and worship with us, and he says, okay, I will go. He hasn't done it yet. He's only expressed an intent to do it verbally, but he's already guilty of idolatry. Whereas the one who come to it by himself of his own accord without anyone inciting him, he says, you know what? This sounds good to me. I'm going to go do it. It sounds good to him in his own mind. No one else said to him that he should do it. So his verbal commitment to go do it is not yet idolatry. Why? Why this distinction between one who incites himself and one who is incited by others? The reason for the difference is that one who makes the decision on his own is apt to change his mind. He hasn't really committed yet. Whereas one who is incited by others is drawn after them, and then once he makes the verbal commitment, he's on a train that is unlikely to change course. Abaye said, from where do I say this distinction? As it is written, Deuteronomy 13:9, you shall not approve of him nor listen to him, referring to another individual who tried to incite him. And the verse indicates that if one approved of and listened to the inciter, then he is liable even for the approval alone. Rava says both this Mishnah and that Mishnah are referring to one incited by others. None of this self-incitement according to Rava. But there's still a distinction, like this. That Mishnah, which deems one liable for merely expressing approval, is referring to a case where the inciter described the qualities of the idol and said to him, the idol eats like this, it drinks like this, it does good for worshipers like this, and it harms those who do not worship it like this. Right? Somebody gives the whole rundown of the form of the idol and how it is and how the idolatry is performed. So in this case, expressing approval verbally suffices to render one liable, as he was evidently convinced by the description of the idol and its powers. And this Mishnah, which indicates that one is not liable for speech alone, this is referring to a case where the inciter did not say to him, it eats like this, drinks like this, does good for its worshipers like this, and harms those who do not worship it like this. He just said, yeah, we're going to go worship, this statue, and didn't explain why or how it's done or anything. And then if the guy says, yeah, I guess I'll go with you, he's not really convinced. He doesn't know what it is that he's going to go do. He doesn't know any information about it. So Rava said, from where do I know that this distinction is correct? As it is written, let us go and worship other gods. From the gods of the people that surround you, the ones near to you or the ones far from you. Deuteronomy 13, verses 7 and 8. So what difference is there to me whether they are near, and what difference is there to me whether they are far? Why would the distance affect the prohibition? Since the Torah mentions distance, it's to tell us something. So what is the Torah saying? Do not be tempted to listen to the inciter, as from the nature of the objects of idol worship that are near you, which you recognize to be false, you can derive what the nature is of the ones that are far from you. Therefore, if you are told that there is an idol in a distant land that is real, realize that it is a lie. It is from this interpretation that Rava derives his halachic distinction. What? Is it not referring to a case where the inciter described to another person the qualities of the idol and said to him, it eats like this, it drinks like this, it does good for its worshipers like this, and it harms those who do not worship it like this? Conclude from it that only in such a case is the incited person liable for stating his approval. Rav Ashi says that there is a different resolution to the contradiction between those Mishnahs about whether you become liable when you just express it verbally or not. The latter clause of the Mishnah on page 67a, which deems one liable for speech alone, this is referring to an apostate Jew. Since he is already an apostate, his stated commitment to idol worship is certainly final. Consequently, he is liable. By contrast, a regular Jew is not liable for speech alone because, there's still ample room to believe he will change his mind before he actually goes and does this, prohibited act. Ravina says that there is no contradiction. Rather, the Tana teaches the Mishnah employing the style of not only this but also that. Meaning, the Tana first teaches the elementary law that one who worships an idol is liable, and afterwards teaches the more novel halacha that even one who merely says that he will engage in idol worship is immediately liable. In other words, Ravina is saying when it says you become liable when you worship the idol, that doesn't mean that you don't become liable when you simply express an intent to do that. They're just telling you the basic law. Idolatry is prohibited. And not only that, but when you say you're going to commit it, you have already committed it. It is stated that the Amoraim, the later sages of the Gemara, engaged in a dispute concerning the following matter. In the case of one who worships idols due to his love of another who requested that he bow before the statue, or due to fear of someone coercing him to do so, but not due to faith in the idol, what is the law? Abaye says he is liable, and Rava says he is exempt. Right? So this was like in the case in the wilderness, the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, and eventually the Midianite women who came and seduced a bunch of young Jewish men to go worship their idol with them. The men were eating manna given to them by God. Why would they go and now bow down to an idol? And in that context, it's crazy. It's unimaginable. Why would they do that? Because they were seduced by those women who said, hey, I'll do such and such with you if you'll bow down to my idol and overcome with lust or, love for the maiden. They committed the idolatry. But they didn't really believe in the idols, that it was a god. They were just doing the act for a different reason. Are they liable for idolatry? Abaye says yes, right? Here we go. Abaye says yes. Rava says no, because he didn't really intend to commit idolatry. Likewise, if they're afraid that somebody, it's not a gun to their head, but still, it's like they're afraid that something, will go wrong for them if they don't do it. So it's not real, it's coercive, and it's not really that they believe that the idol is a god. So Abaye would say, yeah, but you commit idolatry, so you're liable. Rava would say, no, the intent wasn't there, so it's not. The Gemara explains. Abaye says he is liable because he worshipped it. Rava says he is exempt, as the criterion for becoming liable for idol worship is as follows. If one sincerely accepted the idol upon himself as a god, yes, he is liable. But if he did not accept it sincerely, he is not liable. Abaye attempts to cite several proofs whose mnemonic is a slave will bow to the anointed. This is just a phrase to help us remember what's coming. Abaye said, from where do I say that one who worships idols due to love or fear is liable? As we learned in the Mishna, one who worships idols is executed by stoning. And this includes one who worships an idol, and one who slaughters an animal as an idolatrous offering, and one who burns incense as an idolatrous offering. What is added by the Mishnah by stating twice, one who worships? Is it not to include the case of one who worships idols due to love or due to fear, in addition to the case of one who worships idols out of faith? Evidently, in this case as well, the worshiper is liable. That's Abaye's point. Rava could have said to you in response that the term one who worships should not be understood as Abaye suggests, but rather as Rabbi Yirmiyah explains it. Namely, that one who worships an idol in its standard manner of worship is liable, and one who sacrifices an idolatrous offering is liable, even if that is not the standard manner of worship of that particular idol. But in both cases, Rava would say, but he's doing it because he has faith in the idol, not because of some ulterior motive, like love of some, woman who's telling him he should do this, or fear that somebody, will harm him if he doesn't do it. Abaye attempts to cite another proof for his opinion. He said, from where do I say that one who worships idols due to love or fear is liable? As it is taught in Baraisa with regard to the verse, you shall not bow to them nor worship them at Exodus 20, verse 5. To them, to idols you may not bow, but you may bow to a person like yourself. Bowing to a person is merely the acceptance of authority, right? If you've ever taken Taekwondo, there's a lot of bowing that you do with your teammate or your sparring opponent. You're doing it as a form of respect. Never enters your mind that you're bowing because you think that this person, is some kind of, God in human form. No, you're just bowing out of respect. One might have thought that it is permitted to bow even to a person who is worshipped like a god, like Haman in the story, in the Purim story that we're going to be reading in 2 weeks. Therefore, the verse states, nor worship them, i.e., any form of pagan worship is prohibited. Abaye concludes, and wasn't Haman worshipped due to fear and not because the people considered him a god? Evidently, one who engages in idol worship due to fear is liable. And Rava could answer as follows. One might have thought that it is permitted to bow even to a person like Haman in one regard, but not like Haman in all aspects. It is referring to one like Haman, in that Haman himself was an object of idol worship, as he claimed to be a god. And one who worships a person out of belief in his divinity is liable. But the reference is to one who is not like Haman in all aspects, as while Haman was worshipped due to fear, and one who engages in idol worship due to fear is not liable, here the reference is to one who worships a person not due to fear, but because he believes in that person's divinity. Right? In other words, Rava was saying that, well, even if some people bow to Haman because they think he's a god, if you're bowing to him because you're afraid you'll be killed if you don't, right? You don't believe that Haman is a god, but that's fear. So it sounds like, okay, well, if you bowed down to him, maybe you shouldn't have done it. But if you did it, you wouldn't be liable to the death penalty for idolatry because you had no thought in your mind of committing idolatry, according to Rava. Abaye might say, yeah, but if other people bow down to him because he calls himself a god, and the act of bowing to him is by definition an act of idolatry, then if you commit it, even out of fear, you're going to be liable. That's Abaye's point of view. And Abaye furthermore said, from where do I say my opinion? As it is taught in a Baraisa, if an anointed priest, meaning a Kohen Gadol, the high priest in the Holy Temple, unwittingly engaged in idol worship, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi says he brings an offering for the unwitting act. He didn't do it on purpose, but somehow he did something by accident that could be considered idolatry, so he brings a chatas, a sin offering for an unwitting act. And the rabbis say a high priest does not bring an offering for an unwitting act of idol worship unless it was due to a lapse of awareness concerning the fundamental laws of idol worship, i.e. he thought that his action was halakhically permitted. And they agree that a high priest brings a female goat as his offering to atone for his act of idol worship, as does an ordinary individual, and not a bull, as a high priest brings a sin offering for other sins. Right? If he commits an unwitting act of idolatry, and he is liable to bring an offering, it would be a goat, not a bull. Whereas other sins that a high priest does, unwittingly, and he's bringing a sin offering, his sin offering would be a bull. And they agree that a high priest does not bring a provisional guilt offering, which is ordinarily brought by one who is uncertain as to whether he committed a sin that requires him to bring a sin offering or not. In such a case, a high priest would be exempt. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Abaye infers, what are the circumstances of the high priest's unwitting act of idol worship that is not due to a lack of awareness of the fundamental laws of idol worship? If the high priest thought that a certain building was a synagogue and he bowed to it, and he then realized that it is a house of idol worship, why would he be obligated to bring an offering, even according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi? Since his heart was directed toward heaven, it is not even an unwitting transgression. Rather, it is a case where the high priest saw the statue of a person and he bowed down to it. Now, this case must be clarified. If he accepted that person upon himself as a god, well, then he is an intentional transgressor, and he is liable to receive the death penalty and not bring an offering, which is only for unwitting sins. Now, top of 62a, and if he did not accept the person upon himself as a god, but rather he bowed to the statue in order to honor the person, for example, the king, well, then what he did is nothing. He wasn't committing idolatry. So rather, is the Baraisa not referring to a case where the high priest unwittingly worshipped an idol due to love or due to fear of someone? This proves that this is also considered idol worship. But Rava could have said to you in response, no, the Baraisa is not referring to such a case, but rather to a case where the high priest says to himself that idol worship is permitted. He just totally got the law wrong in his mind. So the Gemara challenges, if the Baraisa is referring to a case where the high priest says to himself that idol worship is permitted, this is a case of a lapse of awareness concerning the fundamental laws of idol worship, in which case the rabbis concede that the high priest is obligated to bring an offering. Therefore, what is the difference between the opinion of Rebbe and the opinion of the sages? And the Gemara answers, it is a case where he says to himself that idol worship is entirely permitted, whereas the case of the lapse of awareness in which the rabbis concede to the opinion of Rebbe is a case of upholding part of the prohibition and negating another part of it, i.e., a case where the high priest recognizes that idol worship is prohibited, but mistakenly assumes that certain idolatrous activities are permitted. So he just made a mistake in his mind, and then is that the same outcome as an individual, or is it different because he's a high priest? That's what they're arguing about, and that's where we will stop. I'll just take a couple questions. Sharon, interesting that this is the topic as we approach Purim, where the concept of idolatry is so central. Just so. Thank you, Sharon. And Ifa, was King Solomon guilty of promoting idol worship because of allowing his wives to establish places for idol worship in Israel? I'm not sure. It is a good question, right? I mean, King Solomon, who was the wisest person who ever lived and totally devout, loved God, somehow at the end of his life went completely astray because he violated the law that's in the Torah of multiplying wives. He had too many wives. Why did he have so many wives? Was it because he was such a lusty man? No, it's probably because he was making peace treaties with all these other nations, kind of and marrying their princesses to solidify these treaties. Okay. He thought he had a good plan, But he violated the law that says a king of Israel shall not multiply wives. Right now, so we learn how many is okay. I think the number was like 18. I think maybe David had 18 wives. Like, okay, up to 18, it's not going to go so crazy. But Solomon had 1,000, right? And it went bad. He couldn't keep control of all of them. He ended up, his son was not a worthy successor at all. He was a terrible, terrible king who did such a bad job that the nation split in half. And in part, that's because Solomon had all these wives, couldn't keep track of them. They brought idolatry into it. He didn't build an idolatrous temple. I don't know if he was aware that they were building it when they built it. I don't know, because if they said to him, we want to build an idolatrous temple, and he said, okay, you can do that, well, then for sure he would have committed idolatry. I'm not sure if that's the way the story went. I don't remember offhand. But, it's certainly a valid question. I just don't know. And finally, Joe, will you be reading the Megillah this year? So we have the tradition, right, every year on Purim, Nina and I read the Megillah in English. You haven't, as a Jew, fulfilled your obligation to hear the Megillah read, by listening to us read it, through the electronic media. It should be done. You should hear it live. At the very least, you should read it yourself. Do you have to hear it in Hebrew? Can you hear it in English? I think you can hear it in English, but I don't remember offhand. I'm not a poskening rabbi. I'm not even a rabbi at all. You got to look up that halacha. But it's a fun tradition that we all do together. Nina and I insert a few thoughts here and there as we read the Megillah, and we collect gifts for the poor, right? So the donations that we receive on that day, we don't use for our organization, Accidental Talmudists. We just pass through to organizations that focus on feeding the hungry and sheltering and clothing the poor, etc. So it sounds like we should definitely do that. So thank you for the reminder, Joe. And with God's help, we will do that. That's what I've got for us today. Good Chodesh as we begin the month of Adar, and good Shabbos, which begins tonight. And may we enter Shabbos with joy, and may we have joy during Shabbos, and may we emerge from Shabbos with joy. All the best.